Everybody's talking about Rachel Reeves and what she's planning to do. I mean, all the pundits I see have been going on and on about whether there's going to be an income tax rise. Probably not. She's backtracked. She's run many things up the flagpole, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, a national insurance expansion to all those lawyers and limited liability partnerships, all kinds of weird stealth taxes, reform of ISAs, restrictions on pension tax relief. So there's a whole range of things. We might even see things like, we're certainly not going to see any spending increases. We're probably going to see some kind of mobility scheme crackdowns. But all of this is not going to even begin to touch the surface. So in your opinion, why is Rachel Reeves going to fail?
Well, what you're summarizing is the chaos that necessarily arises from the fact that no political party, no politician actually knows how to solve our problems, whether it's the housing affordability or reducing inflation. They are all making promises that if elected to Parliament, they know how to solve the problem. Except that when they get elected to Parliament, they just continue with the same set of policies that continue to fail. So Rachel Reeves, whatever the combination of policies she does come up with, will not deliver the sustained growth which she claims to be the primary goal of the Labour government in Britain. The big question is, why is it that governments of all political persuasions persist in failing? Why can't they finally solve the problems that have been with us literally for hundreds of years? And until they come to terms with the reality that they are using tools that are programmed to fail, they're designed to fail. Until they accept that, they will continue to lie to the public and create the distrust that eventually leads to people going to the extreme right or the extreme left, believing that maybe what we need is some kind of radical departure from the present. If you want to know why the system is designed to fail, I can tell you.
I'm all ears, Fred. Why is the system designed to
fail? Okay. First of all, think in terms of the market economy. In the market economy, entrepreneurs supply the goods and services that the consumers demand, because the supply and demand is equated by a pricing system. They don't make decisions on what to supply without a pretty good reason that the consumers can afford to pay for the products, the goods or the services that are going to be supplied to them. In politics, that trilogy of supply, demand, and the pricing system is split up. So governments talk about supplying goods without thinking of the scale of the demand. And least of all, do they discuss with the public the price that people will have to pay if their wishes are to be fulfilled. So the consequence of that is the shortfall in the supply of services that people need, the inadequacy of the revenue, the price that the government collects, and an entirely frustrated public whose demands are not being met. The supply, demand, price trilogy is fractured, fragmented, and they're not allowed to marry them up coherently. So at election times, no politician is going to say to the public, if you really do want as many nurses as we really need, you're going to have to pay, because then the public can have a conversation about whether they are willing to pay or not. No politician will broach that subject. It's a sensitive matter for a very good reason. The reason is a historical one. Look, people who go to work produce enough to pay for all the public goods that they want. They could pay for all the policemen, all the teachers that they could want, all the nurses in the hospitals. We do, as a nation, produce sufficient revenue to cover the funding. Well, in that case, what's the problem? The problem is that built into the system is a process whereby a large part of the revenue that we create to pay for those public services is diverted away from the public sector. So that means that we end up with a shortfall in the revenue that's available to pay for all the goods and services that we want. We're working to create the revenue, but the intervention is when the politicians allow a large chunk of that revenue to be diverted away. And if you want me to tell you where it's diverted to, I will do so. But the important point is we do produce enough funds. The fact that the government ends up with a shortfall in revenue is nobody's fault except theirs. They will not speak honestly with the public to explain why there is a shortfall in revenue. And instead, what they do is create the debt. They keep expanding the debt. So then they complain about a budget deficit. And chancellors like Rachel Reeves keeps blaming previous governments as if she or her party wasn't equally responsible in the past for creating the budget deficits and then the retreat to sovereign debt, which leads to nowhere. So, as I say, we do produce enough. It's just diverted away from the purpose for which we produce that revenue.
So what you're seeing, Fred, is there's more than enough money in the economy to pay for everything we need. The trouble is, it's being diverted away from the government. And but the tool she uses, if we increase income tax, if we fiddle around with capital gain tax, that is never going to produce the revenue that this siphoned off revenue has taken away from us. And the only option then is to get us into ever more debt. So there is a way for us to increase our public services, decrease our debt, and us all work more efficiently. So why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, the first point is, yes, the tools that the government uses, capital gains tax or any other tool that is now on offer, that actually retards the productive capacity of the economy because it allows people to duck and weave all the time, which means that distortions occur and everybody's very unhappy. Look, the revenue that we produce, that it should be reserved for the public sector, is the net income, the extra income that we produce over and above what we need for our wages and what we need to fund the capital investments that enable us to produce and deliver the goods and services that we need. That net income is called rent, economic rent. if we channeled all of that rent into the public purse, we would have more than enough to fund all the policemen, all the teachers, all the nurses that we want. We'd be able to fill in all the potholes, and there would not be a problem. However, back in history, the nobility found a way to grab some of that net income. They did it by capturing the commons. They enclosed the land and privatized it, and essentially turned people hostages. They were told, if you want to work on the land, you pay us the rent. You don't pay it to the government to fund the infrastructure of our social system. You give it to us. And so that is how, year in, year out, a huge part of the net income that we produced on a yearly basis is diverted away from the public sector. So in the past, it was the aristocracy who cashed in. The tragedy is that in the 20th century, we democratized that fraud. It's a scam. We democratized it because beginning after World War II, we incorporated more and more of the working people into the process of enjoying the benefits of the scam. Now, that means, on the one hand, we are collecting some of the revenue that ought to go into the public purse, while at the same time complaining that there's not enough money in the public purse to pay for the services we want. So we have this bipolar tragedy, this pathology, this disturbance to the system. And what it boils down to is what John Stuart Mill said in the 19th century. People like me, homeowners, we go to bed at night, we sleep, and we get rich. There is this flow of revenue into the land that's beneath our homes, the equity value of which is going up, which really ought to be going into the public purse. So when I wake up in the morning, I feel a bit richer, but at the same time, I look out in the street and see all the potholes in the roads and say, why isn't the government filling those holes? I've separated out the scam from the practicalities of funding public services. And I'm not aware of that I'm participating in this scam, but that's what it is. And that's why politicians will not talk about the pricing system for funding public goods, because it's a sensitive issue. It's been with us for hundreds of years, and the poor devils who are supposed to solve our problems, find that they make promises they can't keep.
So politicians are part of this scam, you call it. That's the scam whereby we see our house prices and people who rent houses, that price ever goes up. And we don't think there's any consequence to that. But actually, that money, the rise in these rents of all kinds, it's not just the house prices, that's being robbed from the public purse. And therefore, our only option is to put in inefficient taxes that don't really solve the problem anyway. It actually makes it worse.
That's the outcome. And the tragedy, and it's an awful one, it's enough to bring tears to your eyes. What the governments end up doing is pushing part of the cost of today's public services onto people who don't vote, who don't have a voice in the matter. Who are they? They are children who've not yet been born, who are being made to carry the cost of part of the services that we are enjoying today. This is a human tragedy. It's everything that's against what we believe humanity is about. We think that as parents, we want to leave a better world for our children in the future. Instead, we are leaving a worse future for our children because we're making them pay the cost of the debt that we are using today to fund public services. So we're reneging on our responsibilities to ourselves to be consistent in the pricing of public goods, and we're double crossing the unborn generations of children who are being lumbered with this sovereign debts.
So Rachel Reeves will never tackle this economic rent question to take revenue from that. She's just going to mess around with how she extracts the real work that people do from income tax, and she's going to borrow ever more money. Now, here's the one, Fred. According to your theory, Rachel Reeves is going to fiddle while Rome burns, but in a few months' time, maybe a year's time, we're going to face a real economic meltdown. How's Rachel Reeves going to tackle that, if she ever is?
Well, she isn't. One of our problems is what I call political paralysis. At the end of the last 18 years cycle, the Labour government, headed by Gordon Brown, ended up saying, oh, well, all we do is pump more money into the system. So they increased the debt, hoping that to put a cushion underneath the crashing banking system. The banks were too big to fail, they said. So let's rescue them. So they rescued the banks, but that left us with 10 years of austerity. They didn't know how to rebuild out of that crisis. They don't have the vision. They're programmed to stay within the failed system. And so when it happens again in the next 12, 18 months, who is Rachel Reeves going to blame? Well, they won't be in the blame game. They'll be in the business of trying to rustle up more money. But this time is going to be different, because it's not just the banks that are too big to fail. It will now be the governments with their huge sovereign debts that owe as much in debt as we can produce in a year. It's the governments, not just Britain's, but others, that will be too big to fail. But who's going to bail them out? Well, they'll turn to the central banks, hoping to print more money to bail them out. But that will just be money lost in inflation. And well, that we're now on to another topic. But she won't know how to constructively navigate through the chaos.